Hmm.
Okay, so thank you everyone, and Happy New Year for those who I haven't spoken with before in 2018. Today is the Citizens Climate Lobby Canada first international education call of 2018, and we have a long-time CCLer here on the call with us today. It's Dr. David Robinson, and he teaches. Oh, he teaches. Wait, I'm gonna mute you all. Oh, that's better. He teaches economics at now. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. And I'll unmute you in a second, David. David teaches economics at Laurentian University and is director of the Institute for Northern Ontario Research and Development. He's best known in Northern Ontario for his columns in the business magazines that focus on Northern economic issues, and for frequent media interviews and appearances on TVO's Agenda with Steve Paiken. Dr. Robinson has been truly generous of the time that and wisdom he has shared with Citizens Climate Lobby Canada. He has been a guest or a keynote speaker at 4 of our events. As well, he provides a lot of sage advice to me, and I am grateful for the time and wisdom he shares with us. So I'm going to unmute David, and he's going to get started.
Well, hello everybody. You should be able to see a slide with a bunch of street signs on it. And I've used this in presentations about carbon tax and dividend a number of times because there seems to be an awful lot of confusion. Basically, it seems to me people don't understand it, even though it's pretty straightforward. So what I want to talk about today is one feature of carbon tax and dividend that I think isn't well understood, but is absolutely basic standard economics. And it may be useful to you to help explain to other people to just have a little more of the economic background. I wrote this up originally for one of my public finance classes because I wanted to explain to them how carbon tax and dividend worked as part of my lessons on taxation, and passed it to Kathy. Kathy thought you might be interested, and that's how we got here. So what we know is that most of the politicians don't really understand what we need them to understand. They're beginning to realize it's very serious. They're beginning to realize that we need really dramatic action and that there's fairly popular support for it. But they do think it's really hard and complicated. And I think some of them are starting to panic. I think the truth is that knowing that they need really dramatic, strong action while being terrified to act politically has put them in a kind of panic. Because we know that a carbon fee has to be really high. The numbers we're talking about for a minimum is really $150 a ton. And 2 years ago, of course, people weren't putting that number out. Now that is the common number in the press. That is really the minimum serious number to be discussing, and lots of people are going way above that. That's not actually very much money when you think about it. It's about 33 cents on a liter of gas. But from the politician's point of view, to talk about that just isn't politically acceptable. And part of our job is, at this point, is to make it politically acceptable, which is what the dividend scheme does. It's acceptable, it seems to me, politically, if they have a full dividend. And it is almost that simple. Now, the dividend is a simple idea. You just give all the money back to people. The idea has been floating around. We've been pushing it for a long time. Its effect is kind of different for different people. And those little complications, do you like these signs, by the way? I really like these signs as a kind of expression of what the discussion is like. Because the effects are kind of different, it may be useful to try and get the economics clear. So there's two ideas we need. One, I think, is just a graphic idea. It's a picture. And one is a piece of economic jargon. So that's my role. I'm going to give you a piece of economic jargon, and the term is compensating variation. And in economics, that means you do something bad to people and then you do something good to them to put them back in the same place they were before with different prices. Okay, I'll say that again. Compensating variation means you change the prices with a tax and then you give them something back so they're not worse off. You're compensating for the effect of the tax. Okay, now this is really traditional standard economics. There's nothing fancy about it. I've been astonished to realize that in all this conversation about carbon fee and dividend, nobody has called it by its standard economics name. It's a compensating variation. It puts people back where they were. And that's politically really important. It's politically really important because with this compensating variation, we can say nobody's getting hurt. From the point of view of most people, the carbon fee is free. We take the money away with one hand, we give it back to another. Now, people have talked a lot about revenue neutrality. But when they do, they're talking about government's revenue neutrality. We don't really care about government's revenue neutrality. The political question is ordinary people's revenue neutrality. And the carbon fee and dividend is the only scheme that makes a carbon fee revenue neutral, roughly, for almost all households, right? Revenue neutrality for households is what we're after. So when governments talk about revenue neutrality and tax grabs and so on, we really want to say, sorry, you don't understand. The carbon fee isn't going into government revenue. All we're doing is changing a tax, changing a price, and giving people back the money they had. This is not government revenue. One should never let anyone say carbon fee and dividend is government revenue or it's a tax grab. It's not. The dividend part makes it revenue neutral, roughly, for all households. Well, except the really rich ones. I'm sorry about that. We aren't doing too good a job with this scheme of making the really rich people happy. But it's not hurting them much because they're really rich, so we don't have to worry about it. So here's the economics. We can imagine two kinds of goods. There's stuff that has lots of carbon in it and stuff that has no carbon in it, and I'll just call that other stuff. And this is a standard economic cheat of dividing things into two categories so we can talk about them simply. And if you have a budget, you could spend it all on carbon stuff, or you could spend it all on other stuff, or something in between, which is what people do. Okay, so I put a dot there called the mix that's actually chosen. And we economists believe people do their best to spend their money wisely, so they pick the part of that line that they think is best for them. Pretty simple. Now, when we put a tax on, what we do is we make all that carbon stuff more expensive. If it's more expensive, they can't buy so much. So I've put a 50% tax on in this diagram, and now you can't get to that old mix. People can't buy what they used to buy. Oh dear, they're poorer. They really are poorer because they can't buy as much. So they make a new choice, and usually it has less other stuff and less carbon. And the less carbon part is what we want. But we'd really like them to be able to be just as happy as they were before. So the triangle I'm talking about is this triangle here, which is all the possibilities that the tax takes away from people. They can't get to those because their budget won't let them buy anything in that yellow area that they used to be able to buy. Pretty simple idea. But they have changed their behavior when they pick a new point and they buy less carbon, which is what we were after. So we got a price effect that shifts them away from carbon because carbon is more expensive, and that's good. And we have an income effect because they're poorer. Okay, you ought to see the mathematics we do to show income and price effects. It's really pretty awful. But the poorer part is what the problem is. If people feel poorer, then you've got a real political problem. And when anybody uses the word tax, people are afraid they're going to be poorer, and politicians start hiding under the bed. So we need to help them with that problem, understanding that this doesn't have to be a political problem. And of course, the solution is really easy. The solution is the dividend that we already know about. Just keep the tax. Don't keep the tax, charge the tax. That's what I meant by keep there. It's a bad word. I've got to change that. But give the money back. And so here's what happens if you give the money back. Now the things that people can buy are bounded by that new black line. And I'm being a bit fancy by putting in what we call an indifference curve, that red curve. What happens when you change the price is, and you're changing the angle of that line, and I've changed it so that it's at the angle with the tax, and then I've added money to their budget, which let them buy more things. Now, you notice what happened is they can't buy all the carbon they could before in the upper right, but they can buy more other stuff. That's what this switching of the line does. So we pushed people down, and then we gave them money back and pushed them up to where they were before. And that white dot shows that they've shifted to more other stuff because of the price effect. The income effect we canceled out by giving the money back. So we only have the price effect, no income effect. People can't complain. If they have no income effect, they have the same, they can buy the same bundle they bought before. So that's the logic of a compensating variation. If you like econo-speak, you can practice the word. Okay, so there are some features of this that you all know, and you can show with this diagram, and I'm not going to show it with the diagram. I'm just not going to take that time. But if people weren't buying much carbon, they weren't going to pay much tax. So people who were lower on that line would pay less tax. Poor consumers who don't buy much carbon because they don't have much money don't pay as much tax. High carbon buyers, like people who like running around in four-wheel drive trucks in mountains and stuff like that, they're going to pay more tax. Those trucks use a lot of gasoline, they'll pay more for it. And richer consumers in general will pay more. Those aren't really bad things. That just makes it a progressive tax that favors low carbon users, which is exactly what we want. But on average, nobody's worse off. Now notice I say on average, because we know that high carbon users and rich people are a bit worse off. The other side of that is a really attractive feature. More than half the population are a little bit better off. More than half. And that's got to do with the funny distribution of income that we have. More than half the population are better off. And that's not taking into account the environmental gains, the fact that we're saving the world, which you'd think should be counted as being better off. But when politicians talk about taxes, they really can't, they just don't know how to turn. Well, we're saving the world and improving the atmosphere. They don't know how to turn that into part of the same language. So we'll leave it out. Financially, people are on average a little bit better off. Okay? Now I've heard people complain, some of my NDP friends actually complain, well, the rich have more money so they can adapt more easily, so it's not fair. We can easily work out policies that make it possible to help poorer people adapt more quickly, because after all, we're sending them checks. We can say, well, why don't we use those, why don't we give you a big loan and pay it back out of those checks? Hold on to the checks and let you pay it back with your share of the carbon dividend. That'll let you borrow lots of money to retrofit your house. And if you retrofit your house, of course, there goes a lot of your heating costs. More, in fact, we know that retrofitting houses actually pays off economically, and that one of the big barriers is people just can't finance it. So our carbon fee and dividend just incidentally lets us finance retrofitting houses. And that's a really important feature. So, what am I doing here? Am I going backwards? Nope. I don't have anything more I really want to say about this. What we have is a really simple idea that solves the politicians' problems. And I actually like talking to politicians about it because they're baffled and somewhat frightened, which is a big opportunity. So thank you very much. I'm done with my little spiel. If you want more, I'll send you the paper with more diagrams. All done. You're trying to mute me and unmute everybody else?
Yeah, I've just unmuted myself temporarily. I just wanted to first thank you for this. And I think compensating variation is a great way to answer people who don't understand how the carbon fee rebate actually will lower carbon emissions. So this is really helpful. And I never thought of how you could bankroll home fitting by lending against carbon dividends. That's brilliant. Okay, we have some questions in the hopper. So I've got David is, because he was the first to submit a question, David Mance is first, and then Daniel, and then John Stevenson. So and then we'll ask others, but we'll let David go first. So let me find a way to unmute David Mance. There we go. I'm just going to unmute all because I don't know what I'm doing. There.
Okay.
So if you're noisy,
okay, I'm actually.
Yeah. So if you're noisy in your background, please mute yourselves. So I've unmuted everybody. We're going to start with David. I hope I pronounced your last name correctly, David. Introduce yourself and then please ask your question to Dr. Robinson, please.
Right. This is Dave Maines calling from Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. Hello. Am I coming through first off?
I can hear you, Dave.
Okay. Yes. The question I've got is there are multiple market-driven mechanisms to achieve the same end, and the carbon tax is one of them. If you look globally, emissions trading systems predominate over carbon taxes. And it would seem to me that while it's very attractive for lobbying purposes to promote a carbon tax and dividend distribution, at the same time, I don't think it could be detrimental to the argument to get into an argument over which is a better system when an ETS will accomplish the same need. And from a lobbying perspective, it almost seems like if you can encourage politicians and so forth and the public to understand the necessity of carbon pricing, the specifics thereof, that can be dependent on jurisdiction in, does that make sense?
What you're saying makes sense. And in theory, the various trading systems could do the same thing. The majority of economists are clear that a carbon tax is superior to a trading system for a number of reasons. One of them is that a trading system introduces costs. You have to pay traders, and of course those guys don't work for nothing.
Right.
Another reason is that politicians get to control the quantities, and so it's very much more subject to manipulation. The third reason is no carbon emission trading has really thorough coverage, whereas a carbon tax starts off with almost perfect coverage. So there's a bunch of flaws, and if we look at the history, the trading schemes haven't worked nearly as well as people thought. Those are not the big problems. You know what the big problem is? You've got a carbon trading system that's put the price somewhere around $20, and you've got to go to 150 as a minimum. It's extremely hard to push those prices up fast without a huge amount of political resistance in a trading system. So it's easier to introduce a trading system because it hides the tax. But it's really hard to get to where you want to go with a trading system because you're not compensating people for the tax you take away. So that's the main set of arguments.
Okay.
That's great. I think Yannick would like to add a quick follow-up comment to the ETS versus tax. Is that okay, David? You're calling the shot.
Sure, I'm
Yannick.
fine.
Hey, I think I'm unmuted.
Are you the fellow in Toronto?
Yes, I am.
Hi.
Milton, actually. Hi.
Milton, okay.
And I just finished co-authoring a paper for the Ontario Society of Professional Engineers about the Ontario's ethanol in gasoline mandate. And what we found in doing that was that it would actually increase greenhouse gas emissions because of interactions with cap and trade. So I wanted to point out that that's a problem with ETS systems, that politicians are accidentally putting in regulatory policies that do the opposite of what they seem because of cap and trade, whereas the carbon tax is easy enough for politicians to understand.
That's a terrific comment.
Yes, that was. Thank you. And so any other related comments to the ETS, or can we move on to Daniel Pike's question? Okay, go ahead, Daniel.
Okay, hi. Yeah, I've been asked a couple of times with carbon fee and dividend. Of course, you receive a check in the mail, but the alternate way of doing it would be to run it through the income tax system and either reduce people's income taxes according to the carbon fee. And I get a degree of progressivity into it because our income tax system is progressive, and that's the argument for it. But yeah, I wondered what your thoughts were on that and what a pros and cons of it would be.
You could do that. It's not nearly as strong a reinforcement for people, and it doesn't give as strong a signal as getting a check in the mail. You have to wait for your once a year check, and it's mostly something you end up not paying out of money you've already given them. So it doesn't have the same psychological impact. The big argument for not sending out checks is sending out checks costs money, although with the electronic system it's getting pretty cheap. I argue that the political advantages of sending out a check really are enormously outweigh the slight administrative convenience of trying to tie it into the income tax system, which is actually more complicated than it seems because not everybody's paying taxes, so you have to rebate. And now if you have to rebate, you're sent back to sending out checks. If you wanted to make an arrangement so that you didn't send checks to people who had known incomes over $75,000 a year or $100,000 a year, that would be a small that would save some money. But you really do want the checks to give people a sense that they're participating in stopping climate warming. You want to give the signal with the money. You want them to know that they're not losing money on the tax. So in principle, the income tax system would work, but it's not quite as good, and it's not as politically effective, I think.
Great. Did that answer the question for you, Daniel?
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to know how to answer the question myself, so that's a good way to do it.
Oh, that's great. Okay, can we move on to John Stevenson? You have a question.
Yes, I have a couple of questions actually, and I must admit I think they're both kind of in the weeds, so I don't mind if someone like Kathy or Yannick says, "Okay, John, we'll deal with that later." But it concerns the rebates on, first of all, the exports of fossil fuel. And I remember, David, at our 2016 conference, you mentioned that they should there should not be a tax on exports of fossil fuels. Now, this is opposite to CCL's position, as in its laser talk, that it gives border tax adjustments on exports of carbon-heavy goods, but no adjustment to exports of fossil fuel. They're stuck with the tax. And I remember you saying in Canada, you know, we really don't need this. And that was always my feeling. And partly because exports of fossil fuels is such a large percentage of the production of fossil fuels in Canada, and almost all from one province. So if you're going to tax those, put the carbon tax on the fossil fuel production and not give them rebates, it looks very much like the National Energy Plan to me, which would be kind of politically difficult. So could you elaborate on this, please? And maybe correct me if I'm wrong in putting words in your mouth.
Well, I think you've more or less summarized my view. When we burn oil or use carbon intensive things, we should pay for it because we are the emitters. When we ship stuff to the States, they're the emitters. Now, we could try and tax them, but all that will happen is they'll switch to oil from Nigeria. Economically, it doesn't make sense to hurt our industries in a province in Canada for somebody else's consumption. So the border adjustments that would give the relatively small handful of exporters of fuel their money back for the carbon, but not for the carbon that they emit in Canada. That's really important.
Yes.
We charge them for the carbon they emit in Canada. And then we really have to charge for carbon content that comes into the country. That doesn't hurt very much when you're at $18 a ton, but when you're at $180 a ton, we have to get there. And it's going to happen because it's impossible to have a working system without those adjustments if you have players that aren't in the game.
Yeah.
Great food for thought. Did that answer your question okay?
Yes, it appears that we might have some tweaking of our policies somewhere along the road, Kathy.
Yes.
That's my view. And similar with the next point, it's upstream versus downstream. I noticed in the US there's a law which says they cannot have a downstream tax on carbon-heavy goods. That's the export clause. This is all explained in the laser talk. Now, do you have comments? This may be different on the merits of putting the carbon fee upstream or downstream.
The cheapest and most thorough way to do it is upstream before it gets into the production process or consumption process. There's just no question that's cheaper and more efficient. There are some questions about exports, but every adjustment you make after that makes it more costly to run and more vulnerable to fiddling with.
Yes. Now then, we have a principle that the revenue collected in a province is given back within that province. So if you put it on the upstream production in Alberta, a large part of the revenue would be collected in Alberta, and therefore would it be all given back in Alberta, even though we are consuming some of those goods here in Ontario, and we would be paying higher prices here in Ontario, but the revenue would be going back in Ontario, in Alberta, because it's being collected in Ontario, in Alberta. That's the federal policy anyway.
Upstream in practice means the boundaries of your jurisdiction.
Okay.
Whether it is coming out of the ground or coming across a border. And those are relatively few points. There's, 70 or 100 wells in Ontario, and about the same number of border crossing points. So it's not a big deal to, to do it that way.
Okay. It's just, I read the federal backstop, and that is, as that concept in it, about crossing borders, and actually seemed pretty complicated to me, going back and forth and so on. But if that's the answer, I'm willing to live with it.
Those are great, weedy questions, John. I think we have time for a couple more. I don't see anybody in the chat queuing in. Does anyone else have a question for David?
Hey, Kathy, it's Frank.
Yeah, please go ahead, Frank.
Dr. Robinson, so at the beginning of your call, you said many politicians don't really understand carbon pricing. One, two, they're starting to panic. Now,
Yes.
with all respect to the dismal science that it deserves, one doesn't really need a PhD to understand fee and dividend or cap and trade. So, do you think this lack of comprehension extends all the way up to the top levels? Because I'm thinking of some of the ministers and premiers we've seen have made star turns publicly where they've made representations about Canada's ability to cut emissions consistent with a 1.5 degree warming above pre-industrial. And it just seems to be almost fantastical what they're saying. What do you think? I mean, maybe it's a political view that I'm asking for, but do you think they know that they're being out there, or that they actually are oblivious?
I think it's more complicated. They aren't all ignorant. They aren't all delusional. Some of them, I think, actually understand pretty well, but are afraid. I think, in fact, the Liberals understand pretty well, are somewhat afraid, and are moving sort of to massage the public to get them to the point where they can do more. I think that's true, but I still think they're afraid. My sense of it is that the politicians don't live in fact space, science space, or even with economists. They live in a kind of dialogue space where every voice has the same weight. I think that's what democracy means to them. And so everybody who's worried and scared has as much meaning as the scientists. And they just can't help that. So they're overly influenced by the fearful who speak up, and they get fearful themselves. That's a theory, of course, but you can have it.
Fear as a motivating force seems suboptimal, but I understand what you're saying. Thanks.
I have a question, if I could. Kathy's muted.
Yeah, we have a hand up, and Oliver would like to ask a question. So we'll go, if you want to go first, Yannick, that's great, and then the iPhone, and then Oliver. Okay?
Okay. Should children receive an equal dividend check? Or dependents, generally?
That's a bit of a tricky question. I mean, our spending unit is actually a household, isn't it? And in the tax system, we treat children as costing less than adults. And that's probably the most acceptable and least debatable kind of scheme. Is a household with children probably gets half or 2/3 for each child. Or you can be more complicated and age rate it. But I mean, this is I'm not sure I know what the really right answer to that one is, because I don't think there is one. I think it's a matter of preferences.
Thanks. It's one I've looked at a bit, and yeah, can't get a clear answer.
We could make something up sometime. Want a phone conversation?
I would love to have a phone conversation about that. I'd be honored.
Okay, well, we'll pass you a phone number.
All right.
Okay, you can chat individually?
Yeah.
Behind? Okay, cool. There's an iPhone. I don't know who it is. They have their hand up. Would you like to ask a question? iPhone? Don't know who it is. I guess Oliver can go.
Can you hear me, Kathy?
Oh, yeah. who's that? Is that the iPhone?
Maybe it's John Duncan.
Oh yeah, it is you, John. Now I see it. Go ahead.
Okay, here's a simple question. Why do we constantly revert to calling it a tax if it's not a tax? How can we kick this? Can't we kick this habit? It's in our conversation. It's in what we write. It's in what we distribute. Can't we make a conscious effort to change the word? Isn't fee a better word?
Absolutely.
It certainly is for some purposes. I'm an economist, of course, so all the analytical tools I have are about a tax, and it's indistinguishable from any other tax in that technical sense. The political advantage of calling it a fee is something Bruce Heyer keeps hitting me over the head about. And I agree with him. Better, it sounds a bit better. Although I think most of the people we say it to immediately translate it back to tax anyway. So I'm not sure whether we shouldn't just try to win the word tax rather than retreat from it.
I have another comment then. By the way, I live in Regina. So I'm accustomed to going online and seeing any comment on this from Saskatchewan people. When I say it's not a tax, it's a fee, they may not believe me, but I caused them to stop and think. Yeah, and so maybe I'm making some progress there. And if it's sold that way, but essentially I'm a salesperson and I look at it from the sales point of view rather than an economic point of view.
Yeah. In economics, we have a term called a corrective tax. If you're not paying for some harm you're doing, the government should charge you for that harm. And that's a Pigouvian or corrective tax. So it doesn't have the same, it doesn't mean the same thing as a tax, as a revenue collection. But you're right. I mean, that's why we want to use fee when we can, is because we don't want it to be seen as a revenue source. We want it to be seen as a corrective tax. Oops, see, I did it again. Sorry.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think corrective fee is, or corrective tax is better than just the word tax. But we've got some selling to do. We should be analyzing this a little better because I don't think that we're doing justice to the whole concept. That's the end of my comment.
Thank you, John.
Or question.
Yep, there are 2 questions now. Do we have 5-10 minutes left, David?
I've got all the time in the world for you guys.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to definitely end by the top of the hour. So first Oliver and then Adrian, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Sorry about the webcam. My antivirus is blocking it, but I got the microphone to work. So no picture, sorry about that. The question I have is I'm from Vancouver, and we recently talked to one of the local politicians, and one concern she had about the carbon fee and dividend, and she referred to Mark Jacquard,
Yes.
with whom she has worked together in the past. And the concern, it came up again with me when someone today asked about the income tax. Couldn't we give the money back by income tax? So the concern is, what will people do with the money when they get it back? When you're shifting the curve and the point went back to a similar lifestyle maybe, but more with less carbon fuel intensive products, that's really a question. There is some risk around this, right? People might walk to work instead of drive, but then use the money to fly on a cheap vacation to Mexico, right? So the politicians should be worried about what will people actually do and how will it come out at the end, right? There is some uncertainty that could even be quantified in the model. So I wonder what you think about that.
there's certainly uncertainty. It seems to me you raised several things, and I'm not sure where I'd go with that. I mean, people might use it to fly, yes. Well, we want to tax the aviation fuel as well. But they might cross the border to Spokane and take a flight from there. There are leaks in every arrangement, and they may get fairly serious if we get too far ahead of the states.
Mm-hmm.
We can plug most of them with various ad hoc solutions, I think. But it won't be perfect, obviously. And I don't believe the states can stay on this path for that long. Sooner or later, they're going to come along. There's lots of pressure down there. When they do, the uncertainty really goes away, because once the US makes a big move, nobody in the world is going to believe we're staying on carbon. And once people stop believing in it, oil company prices are gone, gasoline automobile engines will not be sellable. You won't be able to sell your gas-powered car because the resale price will go to virtually zero. Once people believe we're serious, the switch is going to happen really fast, which is why we have to jack that price up so fast, even if there are a few leakages. We have to get people believing. And right now, the politicians are afraid that the people won't let them, that the people don't believe, and the people don't believe because the politicians won't say they're going there.
Mm-hmm.
And we're caught. It's like a couple of lovers, it seems to me. Both of them want to hop into bed, but both of them think that the other one's got commitment somewhere else, that they don't love them. And so they just aren't taking the step.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Again, theory.
Yeah.
You might have a different view.
That was a great question, Oliver, and a very thought-provoking answer and question. Thank you, both of you. Last question, Adrian?
Yeah, hi, Adrian here. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay. What about now?
Still?
Okay, good. Just fiddling with my my phone here because I'm on the way home. Okay, so that's why I sound a little out of breath. Sorry. Okay. So my question is related. So in the slides that you sent around, they talked about the rebound effect. And like what was just described, this is what happens when recipients of the dividend use the dividend to buy more carbon stuff. And so this should depend on how important the carbon stuff that they like buying features in their overall bundle of goods. And so if carbon is not that important in the bundle of goods, then the rebound effect is not that high, for example. And so what I'm wondering is if we know, empirically speaking, how important carbon stuff is, and whether or not this rebound effect is really going to be an issue, right? So if it's really high, for example, that price is going to have to go up even more than we thought.
The way I think about this is about 2/3 of our carbon emissions are either transportation or heating buildings. That's rough. That means you push up the cost of carbon, and suddenly insulation and heat exchangers get just a heck of a lot more attractive. It doesn't have to go up very much to have some effect, but if you promise the price is going to $150 in the near future, nobody is going to put in a standard gas, even a high efficiency gas, if they can get a heat exchanger. Nobody is going to forget to put in double pane windows or anything of the sort. So the signal does a lot of work, and there's huge gains once you start getting off natural gas as a heating system. Huge gains. 1/3 of the emissions are there. Similarly, as soon as people are convinced that they're not going to be able to sell their next gasoline engine car, they're going to pay a bit more for an electric car. Demand is going to shoot up, and we're going to flip. Gasoline and transportation emissions are going to drop rapidly. It's not a problem of technology at this point. It's that people are not convinced the price is going to change enough to make a difference. So there's the signal we have to give. That's another thing that seems to me to make the dividend so important, because it makes it possible to say we're going to a high price soon. So everything you've said makes lots of sense. I tend to think of those as kind of second order problems. The big ones are really clear.
Yeah. No, okay, that makes sense. Thanks for the response. And just to add one thing, I guess if in your answer what you're suggesting is that the signal really the signal really matters here. So for politically, what that means then, and maybe for citizens' climate, is that we need to make sure that signal is very credible and that people believe it.
That's right.
Okay.
And that's one of the things Brad Wall has done that's tremendously harmful. The Prime Minister says he's going to put tax in. Brad Wall makes a whole bunch of noise and discredits, makes it seem unlikely it's going to happen soon. Of course, Brad Wall's gone. Is he gone yet? He'll be gone very soon. It's going to get more credible again. I'll lay odds that you start hearing rumblings from the feds about boosting that price faster than they thought.
Just for the record, last week there was in their release for their Greenhouse Gas Act that they are considering rising the price past 2022 already. So, which is great. And we can take credit for that at CCL because we've been lobbying for that. Okay. I don't see any more questions. I think this has been a fantastic call. So I'm going to stop recording, and everybody just like express your gratitude if that's okay. Please go ahead.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks,
This is great.
You're great. Thanks,
Yep.
thanks for all the support.
Great job.
And can you post
Thank you, Kathy.
the illustration?
Sure. I'll give them to Kath. She can send them to anyone she wants.
Yeah, and about he'll send me the PowerPoints, and I'll forward them to everyone. I'll forward the recording as well if you want to watch it again, or pass it on to your members as well. It'll probably be online by Sunday. This has been fantastic. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.